All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to Choctaw Megan Baker. I'm a research associate here in the Historic Preservation Department. And joining me today is our Ryan Spring, who's an archaeological technician in our department. So today we have Dr. James Taylor Carson joining us as our Choctaw. Dr. Carson is a professor at Griffith University and the author of Searching for the Bright Path for Mississippi Choctaws from Prehistory to Removal. This is his book. If you haven't read it, feel free to grab it. We love it, and so we think you guys should also read it. So Dr. Carson is here to talk with us a little bit about his book. So he's going to kind of go through it, and so we're just going to ask him some questions. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A. And so we will go ahead and start it. Go ahead, Ryan.
Great. Thank you, Megan. So I'm just so excited. It's a fantastic book, and it's something that acts as a good cornerstone in understanding Choctaw history. What's one of the great things about this book, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, is how Jamie's able to put his natural biases aside while writing. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's what I find just fantastic about the book. And his ability of words are hard tonight. We'll just roll into it. So Jamie, the first question I have for you is, in studying Choctaw people, what stands out most for you?
Well, it's kind of an incredible story of, and I should preface that by saying, as an outsider, I can only talk about what I read and what I see in documents and archaeological investigations and so forth. And so when I wrote that book, my task was to try and come to grips with the whole people. And it's a great honor to have been invited today to be on your country virtually and to be talking to you about this. If you take the sort of typical historical scholarship and what it's tracked, there's a tracking of an archaeological formation of the Choctaw people in the 1500s, 1600s. It existed, the Choctaw Nation existed as three kind of subgroups, regional groups, clustered around particular families. The United States came along, and its efforts to expel the Choctaw people from their homeland and in Mississippi, what's today Mississippi, kind of forced a rethinking of the nation to become one nation rather than a grouping of different regional clusters and families and Ixas and clans. And then moving to Oklahoma and the troubles that happened there between divisiveness about what's the best way to move forward. The Civil War comes, are we a slave nation or a free nation? The same debate that split the entire United States. And then living between Mississippi and Oklahoma, very different histories, very different trajectories happening there, and of course winding up into two nations divided by the Mississippi River, but also divided by very distinct histories and capacities to exert sovereignty and autonomy. So there's this incredible whipsaw effect of tough circumstances and pressures and dealing with them and emerging and engaging them in creative ways, in different ways, in diverse ways. So that's kind of the official history and documents and historical scholarship. But when I started out on this book, the thing that struck me the most was the Choctaw Nation didn't begin in 1500 or something. It began when the people came out of the earth and dried themselves in the sun. And so, in a sense, the people have always been here from this kind of moment of creation. And this powerful story of persistence and a kind of sensibility that was above events as they happen decade to decade, and this notion of we are who we are. We came out of the earth, we're here today, we're the Choctaw. So there's a tension between the kind of the way non-Choctaws have tried to represent this history, and then what I saw in the documents I was reading, and what I've learned subsequently in this sense of an internal sense of people and nation. Um, and so the tension between those two very different stories to me is the one where the historian can get in and use one to help the other, and use one to flesh out the other, one to challenge the other, and create something that might be useful, and that gives them materials to recover things that might have been lost, or react against and say that's wrong, and because it's wrong, I now know something that is more right. So it's about trying to write something that's dynamic and can be taken how the reader or the student or the interested person engages it and comes to it.
It's great. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think what's fascinating is how, what you're talking about now with, some of the things in the past that we've dealt with. We're dealing with different things today, but we as Choctaws have been able to persevere through these things because we look at things through a different lens, and like you say in your book too, um, we're trying to find that bright path, or to stay on that bright path, as God gave it to us. And I think that's, how do we keep doing that even in today's circumstances? But before I get into talking about the bright path anymore, or some of those other things, for some of the listeners that maybe haven't been able to read your book yet, would you be able to give us a quick overview of it? Just some of the high
Yeah,
points?
yeah. So the book fits in a particular time when I wrote it, and at the time, so we're talking about the mid 1990s when I got started on the project. The scholarship that predated me, for the most part, was written in the late 70s, early 80s, and was very much written on the notion that, first, it was based very much on the notion of race, mixed blood, half blood, mixed breed. It used that kind of language to articulate the histories of Creeks, Choctaws, Cherokees, all of the nations that originally occupied the what's now the American South. Um, and also they were fundamentally written with the approach of great change, and that, for example, Choctaws were this in 1700 and they're this in 1900, and those are incredibly different things, and the changes have just uprooted the culture. There's nothing traditional, there's nothing authentic. So it's very much, I think of it as a kind of romance of Holocaust, this kind of fantasy that Americans tell themselves about destroying cultures, destroying peoples, trying to destroy them, and then writing the histories on them and showing, well, they changed, and they changed in ways that made them more American. It's a hard scholarship to read in that light. So I was reacting against that. I was also reacting against a contemporary of mine, Claudio Sant. We're good friends. He wrote a book on the Creeks, and he very much took up this notion that the Creeks changed incredibly over time and became less authentic because of race. Mixed bloods, he used the concept of mixed blood. The McGillivray family, because they weren't 100% full blood, kind of took the Creeks on a path that took them away from who they were. I didn't see that when I looked at Choctaw records. And so what my book's about is persistence. It's about trying to identify in the archaeological record what are some core features of the Choctaw people before the continent was invaded. And if we track these basic elements, for example, gender roles, men and women occupied very different worlds, had very different responsibilities in the society. If you look at the kind of politics, chiefly government, it's a very particular system of leaders positioning themselves between the people and the outside world, and being a kind of funnel for power, for wealth through trade, for goods they might get through trade. It's a very particular kind of political model. And then the notion of being at the center of the world, and the bright path is what one follows to live a proper life. but there's no consensus on what that bright path is, and so it becomes an object of contention, and that's what gives the dynamism to the society. So I wanted to see. I saw these kinds of things in the archaeological studies I was reading, and I also saw them in 1830s documents. For example, when Greenwood LaFleur would hold council meetings, he'd stand on top of a mound. He'd have people start a fire with logs laid like a cross, a kind of cosmic map of the world. And I saw these deep persistences of things that one could see centuries before. And so I wanted to tell a story of consistency, of persistence, of an endurance in the face of incredible challenges with the European invasion of the Americas, but also wanted to put change in context. So, for example, livestock was something that interested me. Europeans brought horses and cows to the Americas, and Choctaws became some of the leading ranchers in early American history. They adopted cattle and horses very early on, named them in ways that made these animals fit. So, for example, horses, the Choctaw word for horse translates roughly to deer resembler. And so you have this alien being, the horse, and Choctaws get it, and they turn it into a deer. And that makes it fit. And that makes it not challenge cultural beliefs, cultural opinions, traditional practices. And so I was really interested in how the culture was so strong, so well defined, and so persistent that it could take these challenges and innovations and new things from the invading society and make them their own in ways that did not fundamentally disrupt, that did not fundamentally uproot or unhinge Choctaw culture and society. So the book is about persistence over centuries of a very powerful way of living. And it ends with the removal period, which is the normal period when history is, so that I was writing in, that's considered a great rupture. In hindsight, I don't see it as a great rupture. I see it as a great challenge, and never got to tell the story after to track that persistence of these things into Oklahoma and up to the present day. But that's I think what Ryan and Megan, your project is telling that story and with different voices and different perspectives. So that's what the book's about. It's about Choctaws being, persisting, enduring, lasting, and responding creatively to the invasion of the continent and the awful, awful challenges, violence, and conflicts that came from the European invasion.
Cool. Thank you, Jamie. Again, was saying that it's just so fascinating to me how I see our tribal members today in the face with the challenges that we have, and how a lot of the practices in the past transcend to today. Either through leadership, through values, whatever it is that's been passed throughout our generations, we still see that same trend today. And I think that's that shows us, exactly what you're saying, is that we haven't lost who we are or who we come from. We've just changed the way that we go about it. So one of the things in your book that I found fascinating was when you talked about the playoff strategies with Europeans. And I was wondering if you could go a little bit more detail on talking about what the playoff strategies were and what Choctaw leadership was doing to try to use these things to help their communities.
Yeah. So the playoff strategy is a kind of a theoretical approach. It's a model in which one group of people is presented with two challengers, two rivals, or two threats, or two new groups who move into the area. And in this case, for the Choctaws, it was the French and the British at the start. And the Choctaws refused to pick sides, because to pick a side would be to endanger your own autonomy, your own ability to control your destiny. So what early Choctaw leaders in the late 1600s, but particularly through the 18th century, the 1700s, what they did was they played off the French and the British. So they would go to the French and say, "We'll be your brothers. We will welcome you. We will trade with you. We will even intermarry with you and your traders, to build the relationship between us. But you should know that you just gave us, let's say, for example, 50 guns and 3 cases of vermilion. The British gave us 100 guns and 6 cases of vermilion, and so they value us. Do you value us?" And so then the French would go back and they'd bring out more stuff. And the Choctaws would say, "Well, actually, these guns aren't as good as the British guns. The British have promised to set up a blacksmith in one of our villages to fix our guns. What do you think about that?" So they leave the French, go to the British and say, "The French haven't asked us to fight other nations. The French haven't asked us to enslave our, Chickasaws and sell them to the French. They want us to live in peace. Yet you British want us to take people from villages around our own nation and sell them to you. We don't want to do that. But you also need us because you want to travel in the interior and hunt and obtain deer skins. And so what can you give us?" And the British would say, "Well, I'll tell you what, why don't you provide us with deer skins and not slaves?" So that's playoff. It's going back and forth between these two rivals to get as much as you can out of them. But part of it is crude kind of muscle politics. Like, I'm getting stuff out of these people, because if you go back, like, Choctaw leadership at that time was premised on a leader's ability to get exotic goods, to get things from outside into the society, because that's where power comes from. So there's a real, it's not just a cynical ploy to get more stuff. It actually comes out of an approach to leadership, an approach to engaging the world. But what happened was there was also a structure within Choctaw society, as best as I could tell from what I've read and what I've learned, that lent itself to this playoff strategy, causing tensions within Choctaw society. So Choctaw society, particularly the men's society, was divided between peace leaders and war leaders. War leaders tended to be young. To make your name as a man in 1740, you made your name through fighting, through warfare. As you age, you became a peace leader. And that tension is part of, it's again a tension that creates balance, and on the bright path is balanced and leads to a proper life. And it's when things get out of balance, bad things happen. And so the tension between the war leaders and the peace leaders was there as a dynamic thing that would ebb and flow over time, but created an overall stability. But in the 1700s, some of the war leaders preferred to trade with the British, because the British wanted them to go out and fight Chickasaws. They wanted them to go and fight Creeks. They wanted them to fight on behalf of the British Crown to extend and strengthen British authority in what's now the U.S., the southeast of the U.S. In contrast to that, the older leaders, the peace leaders, preferred the French, because the French were not trying to use the Choctaws to fight other nations. The French couldn't support warriors going off and fighting to the extent the British could, and the French did not want to light the countryside up in flames. They just wanted quiet so they could try and build their colonies at Mobile and Natchez and not be disturbed by wars and conflict and fighting. And so this created a tension within the society that, and in the end, led to a civil war in the 1760s between the red leaders, the war leaders, and the peace leaders, the white leaders. And that was driven by the rivalries that colonialism created, but it was also driven by the way those rivalries exaggerated a kind of structure within the Choctaws that was already there and was an important and inherent part of the culture. After the Civil War was over and the French had to leave, you're left then with the British, and playoff isn't possible with one imperial partner. But then the Spanish came, and so the playoff resumed between the British and the Spanish in trying to extract goods, rights, respect, and sovereignty from these two groups. And then when the United States came in the late 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s, the British and the Spanish had to leave because the American Revolution ended their colonial occupations of the land, and the Choctaws were faced with the United States. And there's no possibility of playoff there. You're dealing with one power that wants your land, and so that the capacity to play off multiple imperial powers created one kind of history, and then being faced with only the United States led to a different kind of history, and that is a real turning point in this period. But different kinds of playoff persisted, because then you have Mississippi in the United States, a state and a federal government, and so Choctaws continued always to try and find multiple partners to dilute the power of one, to find allies with the other, and to create a space where they could be who they were and they could do what they had to do and they could live how they wanted to live. So it's playoff is a particularly noteworthy part of the kind of 18th century colonial European invasion history, but it's always, to my mind, been a strategy to always make that space you need to live the life you need to live by engaging the outside world and trying to arrange that outside world in a way that fits with what you want to accomplish.
Makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I see in history is, like you said, once the decline of the playoff strategy with the United States, Choctaw leadership kind of looks at, well, let's go ahead, since we can't play off these different groups. Let's go ahead and be a part of this group. Let's create a strong relationship with the United States. And by doing so, that will help us in the future. And then,
Yeah.
you can see by after the War of 1812 that starts to fall apart once the United States no longer needs the Choctaws, for defense. And so we kind of hit this period of, okay, well, let's push education. Education will kind of help us get there. But you start to see this kind of crazy, all these different strategies going on. It's kind of this new, it's always having to adapt. Leadership's adapting to
Yeah.
these things that are happening. And so my question is, what do you think? I don't know. It's kind of interesting. So what you see is, looking at some of the chiefs, they're trying to play off different federal officials with other federal officials, or, working with some chiefs, not working with other chiefs. And, and then at one point, Greenwood LaFleur just gives up and he says, okay, removal's going to happen. We're just going to go with it. And so he starts, working with trying to get the best deal that, that he can, for his people. But I guess what I'm getting at is, you see these Choctaw politics in, the late 18 teens and the 1820s. Do you think that, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, Choctaw leadership is trying to find the best way to go about finding a solution to what's going on. But in the grand scheme, do you think that trying to find that solution led to a negative impact on Choctaw removals?
I think the thing that frames it all is the lie, the American lie. The United States, like you were just saying, Ryan, needed Choctaws in the War of 1812 as military allies and to kind of keep peace on the frontier between the Choctaw Nation and the growing United States. They needed warriors to help fight the British. But the minute that need ceased, things changed. But the U.S. was always talking about, if you learn English, if you learn how to farm, if you learn the way we organize our society with written laws and constitutions. If you learn these things, you'll belong, you'll be safe. And that was the great lie of the early 19th century in terms of federal First Peoples relations with the Choctaws, Cherokees, because there are many sad moments when you read the documents, particularly that 1820s period, where you can see people like LaFleur or the Folsoms, the Pitchlands, believing that, the United States has charted a roadmap for us to be a sovereign nation, for us to be partners, and for us to have a close relationship. And then when you see the U.S. just kind of, that's not in our interest anymore. And then the U.S. starts treating Choctaws not as a sovereign nation, but as racially inferior people. And that shift means that whatever the Choctaws tried to do to maintain their sovereignty and their peoplehood, whatever they tried to do was done on false premises set up by the United States government. Now, did these reactions sort of make removal worse, or what impact did it have? I can't imagine the stress of being a leader in, say, 1826, 1828, when you know the United States is probing around to find people in the nation who will be happy to, take land, take money, take whatever in exchange for a signature on a treaty. I mean, the U.S. is constantly looking for people who are happy to make a deal. And with the Choctaws, they couldn't really find those people. Other places they did. But to imagine that pressure of knowing there's this massive power that wants your land and doesn't want you on it, and wants to basically take you to another place that you haven't really even been before. I mean, who can imagine this? And I wrote later on calling this ethnic cleansing, and that's what it was. And the U.S. really has never come face to face with the ethnic cleansing of its past. And we saw the horrors of ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, in the late 90s, early 2000s. That's what happened here. So let's not kid ourselves that it was a situation where there was a lot of room to maneuver. But imagine that pressure then. What do? The sense of doom that you can see come over Choctaw leaders at different points is palpable in the documents, and the sense of being at an utter despair over what do we do? How we can't stay. And so there was talk about armed resistance. Do we fight back? And it was widely believed that would be destructive and futile. And so and the Creeks, for example, fought back. A large proportion of their society fought back and were devastated. And the famine and the death that happened there, Choctaw did not have to experience. But the end result was the same: forced removal, a kind of a sham treaty, and a situation in which there was not a lot of choice to be had. But the thing that set in motion a lot of problems that would carry on into what was then called Indian Territory and later Oklahoma was this tension between LaFleur and Mushel in particular, but other leaders as well, because LaFleur became the leader of the let's sign the best deal we can and let's just move on. We can't. I'm kind of reading and adding in between the lines because there's not a lot of documents to go on in terms of perspective, so you get a little glimpse here, a little glimpse there. But my sense, because LaFleur proposed his own treaty and sent it to the federal government, and it went way beyond the treaty that was subsequently negotiated in terms of securing rights for people to stay on their land. I mean, I think his notion was that we can find a way to make Choctaws citizens of Mississippi, citizens of the United States, and they can stay and do what they've been doing. The federal government rejected his treaty. It's too expensive, gave too many rights over. And I think that's the moment when he kind of crumbled and gave up and said, well, we just need to do the best deal that we can. And then other leaders had also come to realize it's time to make the best deal we can. And that opened up probably the ugliest period of politics that I saw in my own studies, where Mushel on the one hand and LaFleur on the other, with the Folsoms and Pitchlands mixing in there as well. It was all about, okay, who's going to negotiate that last deal? Who's going to negotiate the removal? And so they became rivals, and the U.S. exploited that, and that language overlay of mixed blood, full blood. Mixed bloods aren't real Choctaws; they're actually traders. Full bloods are real Choctaws. That kind of language. This is the period when that kind of language, which was an overlay created by the U.S. government to tell a lie about Choctaw people, that there's these traders in their midst, and these traders are mixed bloods. That's when that pernicious racist idea that the United States created began to be internalized as a self-critique with amongst Choctaw leaders. And so Mushlatobi would talk about LaFleur as this mixed blood, is not authentic. And it's removal was a tragedy and a horror on many levels. One, physical story of the actual removals and disease and malnutrition and just being taken to a completely different place. I mean, when you think about the deep knowledge of medicine in the forest, the changing of the seasons, the arrival of birds, the way you grow corn in a floodplain, none of that applied in Oklahoma. It's a totally different place. So just losing your world and losing your ancestry and losing the place where you came out of the earth, trauma of unspeakable dimensions. But the other traumas were the racialization of politics, the notion of traitors and loyalists, all of these kinds of really awful outgrowths of the circumstances at that time then went on to, like the Princess and the Pea, grow or snowball over time and become some of the major themes that defined Choctaw history in the late 19th and 20th century. And it's that crisis and that existential crisis, which, I mean, we call it removal, we call it dispossession, expulsion, but it is on par with ethnic cleansing and the worst horrors we've seen in the modern world, the trauma that it must have caused. And then that trauma is multi-generational and ripples across time.
Yeah, I mean, we still see that trauma today within our communities, and that ripple of all those traumas built up and built up and built up. How can you live when you're juggling boulders on your back?
Yeah.
One of the interesting things I remember reading was when you're looking at Greenland LaFleur, and he was sending his treaty proposal off to the United States. It's at that moment where a lot of people look at Greenland LaFleur as being selfish because of what happened in the end, and I went along with that for a long time. But one of the things I realized is when he sent that to the United States, at that time period, he was breaking tribal law and he could have been executed if he was caught for that.
Yeah.
And to me, as a leader, again, from his viewpoint and his lens, he was trying to do the best that he thought was right for his people in that moment. And I think all the leaders were really, but it's just, it was an extremely difficult time. Always will be. Megan, did you want to take the next question?
Sure. So your early work, you also spend a lot of time talking about the role of Choctaw women in society. And can you tell us a little bit why you thought this was an area that you spent a bit of your time kind of focusing?
Yeah, so here we're talking about gender, men and women. When I first tried to read the archaeological reports of early Choctaw life and whatever documents I could get my hands on, it was clear that, and I mean, this is obvious in a sense, being a man or a woman was important. It defined, in a very basic way, your place in society. And the scholars, the historians who'd written about Choctaws, or about even other First Nations up to that point, never really spoke about women. Women were always this mystery. What's happening with women? What's going on over there? And the tragedy of it is that women are always present in the documents. Their power. Let's give an example. Let's say you read about a European official comes to a village, and the first thing he's going to do is be feasted, and it'll be women who serve the food. The documents that describe this, let's say it happened in 1770, we'll say, and the women are drudges because they just serve the men. It was kind of imposition of an English view of women on Choctaw culture. But then you get into the archaeology, and you find figurines that show women making corn, growing corn, processing corn, and corn was the most important foodstuff. And you see in the early documents, they describe women working in the cornfields, not men. And so you realize that women were the food producers. And so when they're serving the food for these Europeans, they're exercising a kind of diplomatic capacity by being the first people who interact with this European official, and also welcoming that person and making a place in the Choctaw world for that person by sharing their food. So if you look at the values that inform the behavior, rather than the description that the European who doesn't know what's going on offers, you see women exercising power in all kinds of places. Another interesting thing was with the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. If you read the U.S. government records of that, there are no women present. But there's the old oral history that I think it was David Halbert, I can't remember, who recorded some oral histories of Dancing Rabbit Creek. And in his retelling, there was a group of women who were sitting right in the middle of clan mothers, sitting right in the middle of the treaty talks and actually denouncing different Choctaw men who would get up in favor of selling the land. I mean, that is, as a historian, you want to find a kind of oral memory that totally punctures and upturns the official documentary record, which is about all you've got to work with. And that is an instance that does it, and it shows the persistence of women's power and importance in the society, and it pops up all over the place. And to try and get a comprehensive sense of what Choctaw life was, then you have to include women because they're fundamental. I mean, women were responsible for the plant world. They were responsible for growing food out of the ground. They were responsible for what in English one would call land ownership. And people trace their ancestry through women, not through men. So if you were today, you would have your mother's last name, not your father's last name in the kind of English patronymic system. So almost every meaningful structure in the society ran through women. And if you don't make the effort to say what's happening there, because not many people had looked at it when I was writing this book, you uncover a lot about the entirety of the society and about why it works the way it does. So just as women were essential to welcoming and making it possible for Europeans to come in and negotiate and talk and meet, they're fundamental to the story that I wound up writing based on my research. And you couldn't write that story, and you have to have some integrity as a scholar and some honesty. And I had no idea that would be an outcome of what I was doing. I had no idea I would go off into this path into women's life, women's power, women's culture. But you're confronted with it when you read the documents and when you look at what you're seeing. And then you have to investigate it and see what's going on there. And then the whole world opened up once I realized I was able to pick apart these little mentions of women here and there and make something bigger out of it by stitching it all together based on the bigger picture. So it's fundamentally essential to the story. And also interesting in its own right, because women were the really innovators and leaders in kind of grappling with this colonial invasion of their land, and how do we cope with it, how do we change and adapt while maintaining who we are, why we are, and what we're going to be.
Yeah, I particularly really love that you come to this because of the method that you employ of like the ethno-history, and it's like you have to understand the cultural kind of norms and the kind of organization to lead you to that kind of insight. And I feel like that's something that we're always trying, people who want to work with Choctaw Nation, um, it's like you have to understand our culture, like because we have different rationale that you won't ever think about as an
Yeah.
outsider, but to us it's so obvious why a certain thing kind of goes down the way that it does. And so I feel like the time that you spend so much in your writing in the articles about Choctaw women is kind of really so reflective of it, and so then it just captures it so much clearly and a lot better than some of the other histories. And so I've always really appreciated that part of it.
Thank you, Megan. So I think you've touched on this. So you talk about how race has little bearing on Choctaw politics, and it's more centered around the culture. But can you go into a little bit more detail on how you came to, I guess, that conclusion in your book, despite all the other writings? And I know you've talked about it a little bit, but I was wondering if you can go into a little bit more depth on it for our listeners, the readers.
Yeah. So historical so let's take our starting point as this 1820s period, which Ryan had mentioned earlier. That's really when the crisis of removal starts, and the U.S. is no longer willing to entertain being equal partners or sovereign friends. It's the U.S. wants to land, and that's that. That's a period when the United States starts using racial language to talk about First Peoples like the Choctaws and Cherokees and Creeks, and to talk about there's full-bloods who are real and authentic but ignorant, and there's mixed bloods who know English, who maybe they own a cotton plantation, or they run a trading factory. They're savvy in the world of business, but they aren't authentic. They're parasites. They're this like fake class, and all of this is coming out of American racial ideas and norms about whites being superior, everyone else is inferior, and if you have one drop of non-white blood in your body, you're a racial inferior. So there's this racism, and then there's this paternalism, which in this case was premised on the notion that Choctaws were ignorant savages and they don't know how to live in the modern American world. And so they create this language about Choctaws, and they talk amongst themselves in these terms: poor, ignorant, full bloods, traitorous, deceitful, lying, mixed bloods. So it's all framed in an American racial discourse, and it's coming out of the American mind. And I'll just in parentheses put, this to me is the fundamental story of the United States. It's the warping nature of racial thought, which doesn't allow people to be many things at once. You can only be one thing, and that thing fits in a hierarchy. And that hierarchy is defined by the power held and claimed and asserted by the people who identify as whites. So the U.S. has this rhetoric that they're building, this racialized rhetoric that they're building, and you don't see it at all in the Choctaw kind of internal documents that you can get your hands on, and descriptions of things. You don't see anyone pointing fingers and saying, well, you're full blood, you're mixed blood. It's not there. And that's when I started to think that the way the histories had been written is a lie, that historians are taking American language and imposing it in a place and time when it wasn't even used and it wasn't considered legitimate or even part of the world view that people had at that time. And so I did genealogies of the different leaders, Folsoms, Pitchlands. Didn't make it into the book, but I had on my wall at the time these really complicated charts, because this is nothing easy to piece together. But what I found was that the political factionism that was starting, the kind of more pro-American and less pro-American, or more pro-compromise, less pro-compromise, these kinds of factions that were forming, were in the language of race made up of full bloods and mixed bloods on either side. This notion of race had no impact, does not describe in any way this actual situation on the ground. It's a rhetoric. that is used for propagandistic purposes. But then the more the US uses that rhetoric, the more it becomes a tool that can be used to gain internal advantage. And so the removal crisis was what made mixed blood, full blood a term that jumped like a virus from American policymakers into the Choctaw Nation. And someone like Mushulatubby was at the forefront of saying, Greenwood LaFleur is mixed blood, he's a traitor. Now LaFleur's behavior, sending off that removal treaty, and as you suggested, Ryan, violating tribal law, fit that narrative, but he's not doing it because he's a mixed blood. He's doing it because it's the solution that he sees is probably best. But then you start to see as the removal treaty has been finalized and people have to get ready to move over to what's now Oklahoma, they start talking about mixed bloods and full bloods and using this kind of racial language as a weapon to gain advantage and gain a following and gain a footing within Choctaw society to be the people who'll be positioned to assert leadership over in Indian territory. So this internalization of an American conceptualization of race, language of race, has been, I think, one of the most destructive forces across First Nations. It's been destructive internally in the United States. It's the most pernicious force that there is in the country today. And it's powerful and it's seductive. And if you can master it and use it, that's how you get power in the United States, is through racial language. Look at Black Lives Matter. It's a different situation, but again, it's a deployment of the language of race to argue about things. So it's a fundamental American condition. And when the Choctaws took that language and began using it, they became in a way more American because they bought into this racial logic that was born in terms of Choctaw history in this particular moment in time. Prior to that particular moment in time, you don't see any kind of racial consciousness, any kind of it's who's your mother, your mother's Choctaw, you're Choctaw. There's no half this, half that. There's no portioning out blood quantum. You either are or you aren't. And so that's a real turning point. And the after effects and the aftershocks of adopting racial language and then racialized identities, is probably one of the main stories that emerges out of the post-removal period. I'll just add real quickly too. The place of race, it's very hard to find alternative languages to it. It's very hard to step out of this logic of race that's so powerful in an American context. It's powerful in American history. American history is written in terms of whites and blacks and Indians, First Peoples. I mean, I was in Canada for 20 years and you don't use the word Indian there. And so the power of race to define and structure and serve as the main narrative of a story is incredibly hard to overcome. And it's a real challenge to find ways to get around it and find a different language. But that's part of the power of a history like Choctaw history, is there's a history before race. There are ways of thinking about who we are and how we belong and how we fit that have nothing to do with the history of the creation of racism and the kind of European colonial invasion of the Americas. So there's something to be recovered and maybe thought about and to have a heritage that extends beyond race, which Anglo-Americans don't have, is a great potential to find a different way to talk about oneself, to talk about each other, and to talk about how we all fit.
Yeah, and it's hard, like you said, because we've internalized it to the point where it's part of our Constitution today.
Yeah,
it's part of our enrollment. Is this, like you said, this racial consciousness, and I think that will be, if not, my generation or the next generation, but the generation afterwards, we're gonna, have issues with this when it comes to how we're gonna do our enrollment and all those other things in the future. Because right now we're going off of a system created by the United States to get rid of us.
Yeah.
And when we're playing right into that. And so I think, that is definitely a great conversation, is how do we go about turning that around? But that's something that will be, for another talk at another time.
Yeah.
I want to, just for all of you too, we do see your questions. So we will get to them. I just want to hit on some of these other questions, and then we'll let y'all have your time as well. What do you think led to the decline of the Ixa system and its role in the day-to-day community? Moving
Right.
over to having a constitution in 1828, and kind of taking on that, I guess you could say from the the American side of improving our day-to-day.
Yeah. So the Ixas are family kinship-based groupings that characterized Choctaw society before the invasion, and provided the logic, like I was talking about, war and peace chiefs. The Ixa system underlays all of that. So you have these different structures that give shape and form and to the society, that define people's roles and relationships to one another. The Ixa system, because it's based on kinship, is probably the real rival to the racial system that came along later, because it's an alternate way of defining belonging and defining who one is, with nothing to do with race. But what I think what the leaders found was in the 1820s. We keep going back to that period because that's the decade where a lot of things end and begin. The United States is constantly looking for people it can negotiate treaties with to surrender land. And the Ixa system held the society together, but also made the space for a lot of dissent and disagreement. I mean, think of families. Families disagree at the dinner table. This is the dinner table writ large. It's not a failure, and it's not a weakness. Until an outsider comes along and can identify it as a way to gain leverage or a way to gain advantage in a way that the people themselves don't quite understand, because they believe the United States, when it talks about being brothers, talks about being partners. They're not really that aware of the agenda the U.S. has to totally undermine and remove this whole society. So the shift from the Ixas to more constitutional government was about trying to position at first three leaders, the leaders of the three regional groupings, and then one leader, to be the sole person that the United States could deal with, to put an end to the U.S. agents running around, going through society and trying to find allies here and there that they could use to kind of splinter Choctaw society from within. And so it was very much, I think, a question of self-defense and pragmatic response to this existential threat that was the United States. We need to find a way to focus decision-making and not have decision-making scattered amongst different clans, different families, different Ixas, where you can have, like, let's say 80 people making different decisions at any one time. We need to have one person, so that we're united, we're solid, and we know what's going to happen, and we can put the U.S. at the table with that one person and see what's happening, and not have these kind of secret channels and secret negotiations going on. So it's a function of a response to the circumstances at the time, and trying as best as they could defend their sovereignty, defend their nation, defend their land, defend their people. And one of the compromises was to kind of set aside this very effective but also fractious and complex kind of internal political system with something simpler, something more centralized, and something more useful in this struggle against the United States.
That makes a lot of sense. I always kind of wondered why. And I've had people explain to me too that they said, oh, it's because the mixed bloods pushed the full bloods out and made this constitution. But it's something that Choctaw leadership identified as a need, and our society agreed, to this isn't working. What else do we have? What are the people around us using? And let's use that to our advantage.
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense. Do you have any leads for us on where we can try to find a copy of the 1828 Constitution?
A possible lead. It's in the Gilcrease Institute, I think, and one of the Pitchland folders.
Interesting.
Probably Peter Pitchland. I can't remember though, but I remember coming across it.
Mhm.
It's about this thick.
Mhm.
It's written in Choctaw, and it's either the National Constitution or it's the kind of regional constitutions of the three districts. I didn't know Choctaw at the time. I saw this document, and God, there's like, if I could go back in life and change 5 things, one of them is I would say, whoa, people, or Gilcrease archivists, you need to take these papers right here and take them out of this folder, and you need to call the Choctaw Nation and tell them this, I think, is the Constitution. So
Right.
I'm pretty sure it's in one of the Pitchland folders. If it's not a Pitchland folder, it's a Folsom folder at the Gilcrease.
Okay, great. We have a good relationship with the Gilcrease, and we've worked with them on several projects. So we'll definitely
Yeah, I
reach
wish I
out.
knew exactly, and I wish I'd photocopied the thing, but I'm there for 2 days and I couldn't read it. It's in Choctaw, which makes you wonder if a missionary transcribed it, because I don't know of any Choctaw leaders at that time who wrote in Choctaw. They wrote in English, but this thing is in Choctaw. So anyway, if you can find this document, and it's hefty, that will be. It's got to be like one of the most important artifacts, pieces of the Choctaw past that's out there to be found that has not been identified as what it is.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah. Oh, well, the Gilcrease also gave us the entire finding aids for the Peter Pitchland collection, and I feel like I didn't pick up on that as I was kind of going through them. But,
I don't think it's listed. I don't think it's listed on a finding aid.
Okay.
It's just there. And you just have to be kind of going through the files, and then you stumble on this really thick document, and there it is.
That is great. Yeah, I have been meaning to go back to the Gilcrease once we've been able to travel again. So that would be first.
Because nothing on that document is in English. So whoever created the kind of finding aids would have had no idea what it was. And so it's just there.
Cool. Yeah, we will.
Probably good.
Road trip.
But I hope you can find it. And I remember that moment sitting at the desk, finding this thing and kind of realizing what it was, but not appreciating the magnitude of it.
Awesome. Thank you. Megan, do you want to take the last 2?
Okay, yeah, so we could just build off what you had said. Well, if you could go back now, what would you kind of change about or add to the account that you've provided already?
I changed the title. I would make it Searching for the Bright Path. I wouldn't have the word prehistory. That's, I think, an offensive term. I wince now when I see that term, because it suggests that it conjures ideas of prehistoric. It conjures ideas of time before things were legitimate. It's an Anglo word. It's an Anglo concept. It doesn't belong. So that's the first thing. The second thing would be, I really regret not trying to find partners in the Choctaw community to talk to and to weave contemporary traditional knowledge into the story and to inform it by that, because I spent so after this book came out, I was teaching First Peoples history in Canada, and was reading about how can you teach this history in ways that resonated, that are consonant with First Peoples ways of thinking about the past, and that aren't Anglo. Basically, how can I do something other than what I've been trained to do? And I came to develop a real respect for oral tradition, oral knowledge, traditional knowledge, knowledge keepers. And I wished I'd known that then so that I could have tried to find people to talk to, just to get either a nudge in a certain direction or play ideas off of. And I was an amateur. I didn't know what I was doing. So I kind of found offices and people in Mississippi and Oklahoma, and I'd write letters, and I never got a response, but I should have gone there and I should have said, hi, I'm interested in this. I didn't do the legwork and to build the relationship with community to kind of collaborate. And that's my great regret. What I did was live in a hermit's world, in a hermit's mind, and try to read all these documents because there's just thousands of documents to be read, complicated archaeological surveys, anthropological ethnographies. And I just tried to say, what is the Choctaw story and all of this stuff written for the most 95% written by non-Choctaws who didn't understand the culture they're describing? What can I find? And I just did the best I could. But yeah, it's been 20 plus years later, and I think it's that lack of community partnership that I would do differently if I could do it again. Co-author, in a way, the book with the community. It just can't be done like I did it anymore, I don't think. It's not right. It's not proper to set yourself up as the academic who's the professional scholar who knows these things and then creates, like I did from my monk's existence in archives, this story. I still like the story, and the Choctaws I've met over the years have said this really tells me something, and so that's encouraging that I didn't blow it, but it could have been done better, and it could have been done in collaboration and in partnership. Because the point's to find something usable.
Well, it certainly was usable for us, and because it is also such an immense kind of archive. We work with the different kind of archival documents, and I feel like there's so much more for Choctaws than there are for like a lot of other groups. And
Yeah.
we're often so overwhelmed with the amount of like, oh, you haven't looked at this, you haven't gone to this, you haven't seen this, and there's always like more and more. And so you've made sense of it for us in a way, being like, okay, like this kind of part is we trust his work, and so that makes it a little bit easier. And so like we can always go back to his kinds of sources if we really want to, because they're already, someone has already gone through them and done that kind of work with, and so we can build from it. And so I think it's so kind of like,
Yeah.
I wouldn't knock it, like I still love it, and I still and it's really great to hear you kind of reflect on the book 20 kind of years later, because it was also such a different time period for being a historian back then. And so now what you're saying now is totally kind of, I feel like, starting to become the norm in history. Yeah. And so it's kind of really great for you to be like, oh yeah, I would totally do it this kind of way. And I'm happy to hear that.
And just like for people who are listening or might watch this, as a historian, for every page you cite in a footnote in a book, you will have read 200 or 300 pages. So there's a lot you read. The archives are not filled with gems. They are hard to find, and it's a laborious process. I remember getting these reels of microfilm that are about this big. They would each have 1,000 frames, and you'd have to go through those. It would take days, and you'd find maybe 2 frames that had usable material that found its way into the book. So there's a real sifting process that goes on. And the power of the author to become the story maker of these disparate little bits you find here and there, trying to pull them into coherent shape is the real challenge. And the thing I enjoy most about writing history is using your own skills and what you know to try and tell a story that links this example over here that you found, and that's the other example you found 700 pages later.
Yeah, definitely. Like as a person who is writing like history herself, I like, it's a thin book, but it is so dense because you can just tell the amount of depth there is and how many documents kind of are behind it. And so it looks something really easy and clean, but it's like, oh, it's a lot of work kind of behind that. And like, sometimes I don't think people realize how much goes into being able to tell the story in that kind of way. So is there anything more that you've uncovered or learned that you haven't written about that didn't make it to the book, possibly, that you want to share with others?
Um, I get emails from people a couple of times every year, somebody who's gotten a hold of that book, and they're either trying to do genealogy or they're trying to figure out maybe they have a claim to some land in Mississippi, because there's a whole I wouldn't even know how to start the illegalities that went on around dispossessing Choctaws of actual legitimate titles to land that they had in Mississippi. I think it subsequently got resolved. It's like the big payout in the 20th century. But there's people who use that book to accomplish or find personal things, and I think that's well, it's touching to see that a work of academic scholarship can become something personal to people, and then it's a tool for them to use to try to recover something that they've lost. And they've lost it because of ethnic cleansing. They've lost it because of this concerted effort by the United States to obliterate what existed on that homeland. But things I've learned subsequently, I've learned that yeah, it's that community partnership that's the essential thing, and it's what's going to be the future of this kind of scholarship. And the one last thing I'd just say is I began this book with an excerpt from a short story written by William Gilmore Simms. Now it's based on something he saw. If you read his personal papers, it's this murder, and then the guy has to offer himself up to be killed to compensate for the murder he committed. So it was an incident he witnessed. He wrote it in his diary, I think, and then he elaborated it into a short story. And I put that at the beginning and at the end to emphasize that this is a story that I'm telling. It's not true. It's not real. It's a different kind of fiction. But I think what's gratifying is to have been invited to talk here today is that something doesn't have to be factual to be true. Something, lots of things can be true, and to have been able to tell a story 20 plus years ago, all by myself I should, though, thank my supervisors, Mike Green and Theda Purdue. They were my doctoral supervisors, and they were poking and prodding me with questions all along and pushing me in different directions. So they're fundamental to whatever I was able to accomplish, and I pay my respects to them. But to have this thing resonate, with you, Megan, and with you, Ryan, today, and to be talking about it is one of the most gratifying experiences I've had as a professional. And that book set me off on a different way to write history, which is always to try and find the language that the people spoke, what things meant, and to try to pitch history in reference to what the people at that time valued and what their culture and their beliefs were, and to not simply try to bring an Anglo overlay onto some story and tell it, but to try and become a different kind of person to write it. And that's what I learned from it. And it went on to shape the rest of my career up to now.
We're so thankful for you to have joined us. This was really amazing, and I've learned so much, and I really appreciate the chance to just talk to you about this thing that I just love so much. So yeah, I don't know if Ryan wants to say something as well before he goes into the questions.
Nah, it's just been amazing, and I have some questions of my own, but I wanna let our audience be able to ask some of their questions first and give them plenty of time before I keep talking, as I do quite often. So Allison Woolbert asked, were there more than two genders within the historical perspectives in your research?
There was a mixed category. There were men, certainly in the documents you can find records of men who dress and behave as women. But as far as I could tell, and this is very scant detail, scant sightings of this, those as we would understand today, those men who then dressed and behaved and passed as women were women. Now, other First Peoples cultures across North America, there's the notion of Burdash, and there are people who live between genders and who embody both. I didn't see any of that. I saw you're a man or you're a woman, but it wasn't defined biologically. It was defined culturally and behaviorally. Now, it tended to map onto a biological difference, but not always. But I didn't see that third category that you can sometimes see in other groups, and I think that's one of two things. It's either a reflection of just a lack of source material at that time, and the source I'm thinking of is 18th century, or it's a reflection of the variety of different cultural ways of being across Native North America. Different places have different traditions, and we sometimes, I know as historians and just as lay people, don't appreciate the incredible cultural complexity that is, and will be Native North America, and the diversity that is there of practices and traditions. So didn't see any evidence myself for a third order of gender, although there are precedents for that in other societies that come from different cultural traditions than Choctaw.
I think that's fascinating. You know, this is definitely a question that we get asked in our department quite a bit, and it's not always something we can answer because we don't have the source material. So if you're able to share that source with us, that would be fantastic.
Okay.
To help with some of those questions. But you know, this kind of goes into that role of, you know, when we talk about how there, you know, there's men and women. I think we always talk about that from a biological sex perspective, but I think it's important to understand that it's also a gender, you know, and, you know, in Choctaw society, you know, there was room for that fluidity. And, you know, we don't know a lot about it, but, you know, to me, it's fascinating because women as the givers of life are honored because they're able to give life. But that doesn't mean that that's only from their ability to bear children, but also their ability in the plant world, or their ability with being able to act as providers, you know, to be able to provide a lot of the art forms that were needed for our society to function. So yeah, I think a lot of times we get a lot of these structures from, you know, archaeology, or we get them from history or these ethnographies, but we have to understand that, you know, it was a whole, you know, different world coming from our own unique mindset, and there was, you know, a lot of openings for those sorts of things. So something we really want to learn more about. It's something that, you know, we have, you know, quite a few people asking us, and, you know, it is something that we are actively trying to research. So thank you, Allison, for your question. One of the other questions is Eric James was asking if we could expand more on the idea as Choctaws as a matriarchal society, and, you know, go into that in a little more depth. You know, that's something that's definitely, you know, our department has talked about, but I would love to see, I would love to hear Jamie's perspective on it from, you know, what he's researched and what he's seen.
Yeah, and I also looked into this issue with the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people. It's another matriarchal society. It's a different cultural tradition, different origins from Choctaws, but another example of a society. And some of the practices were very similar. So I'll kind of use some of that, because again, you're always trying to reconstitute something you want to be whole from fragmentary, patchy sources. And so I'll kind of supplement what I learned from reading the Choctaw sources. But the structure of the society is female. Who your mother was defined what family you belonged to, what clan you belonged to, what Ixa you belonged to. It defined who you could marry and who you could not. It defined where you could live and where you could not. And for example, if you married into, let's say you married the daughter of a woman, as a male, you would then leave your family and go and live with your daughter's family. And that's called matrilocality in anthropological language. So women had the homes, the dwellings, the farmland was divided and controlled by women. And again, I don't know of any real detailed way to get into how that worked either. It's all, remember, most of this is being described by Europeans who are already biased against women, and who have their own preconceptions that everything they're seeing is savage. So to count on them to actually give a bit of detail on how things worked is doesn't work. So you have to kind of match things together across time, across decades, and then with anthropological theory. But every structure in the society, place, economic work, labor, identity, all related to, began with women. Um, and that probably, where does that come from? Probably the notion like the Choctaws crawled out of a hole in the earth. So the earth is the fundamental mother and it's the basis of everything. So it's earthly representations, women would likewise be the structural foundation on which everything else sits. And then men's life, kind of, it's kind of, I always get the sense it's kind of ephemeral, floating along on top of structures created by women. You know, they go off and hunt in the fall. They would go off to war in the spring and summer, and then they would sit around the council house and talk. And while women ran the society, and women would accompany them on their hunting endeavors and their warfare endeavors. And play incredibly important roles there too, because when the hunter killed the deer was handed over to the women. When the warrior captured someone, that person was handed over to the women. So women are always there as like, to my mind, 80% of what happens was defined by women. And again, like we talked about with contact with American racial ideas, introduced and internalized this alien idea about race. Contact with American society, and particularly missionary education, challenged this gendered way of living. And what you saw was a change and an internalization of American gender norms over time, to a shift from a patriarchal society to one that was paternalistic and defined by women, by men holding the power.
Great, thank you. That's, yeah, I really like your perspective on that. It's good to have, it's good to have some of that, different perspectives sometimes, because you know um, we've researched it and we've said it, and it's nice to know that it's what we found in our research is similar. And what we still see in our society and what's been passed down through our societies, it comes from that source.
And those are the materials to reclaim, reinvent, renew, that can, I don't know, maybe lead a way out of the trauma that we've been talking about that's accumulated over the years. It's not going back to the past, but taking the past to inform that. And in the end, that searching for the bright path, it's a contest, and it's an adjustment process, and it's contestation and challenging and finding the way forward. But having those kinds of materials, cultural materials, memory materials, gives a richness, kind of a rich toolkit from which to draw to respond to the challenges that are happening today, that that are unique and special, and have lived the test of time.
So we have another question. Jean Ann Siago. They ask, or that you say, it absolutely was ethnic cleansing. The idea of blood quantum was codified for Indians and not for other groups. Why do you think that is? Like, why do you think that the practice of blood quantum kind of came in during that Dawes period? I mean, we understand the repercussions of it, and we understand, I think in general, what it was meant to do. But just from your knowledge of that time period, and Megan, this is open for you too. Why do you think that this was chosen and used?
Well, and blood quantum is there as well with Anglo-Americans and African Americans, and it's called the one drop rule. And the only blood quantum that matters is if you have any, as a person known as white, if you have any African American ancestry, you're not white. So the blood quantum on the black-white divide is, there's just one criteria. The blood quantum rules that came into Native North America, First Peoples, First Nations, around the time of the Dawes Act was, I think, an effort to scientize identity, and to create something incontrovertible. I am 60% Cherokee, or I am 40% Choctaw, and here's my blood card to show that, my ancestry, my genealogy, because the United States insisted on a racial basis of everything. It wouldn't take a cultural notion. It wouldn't accept self-identification. So again, it's like you have to play the game. You have to play the game. You can't create your alternate set of ways of identifying, particularly in relation to these land claims and then membership on tribal rolls. And so it's a function of the tests that had to be met to do what you had to do to get what little you could get in this relationship with the federal government. But then it became this structure now where I remember, like, the Cherokees struck all Afro-Cherokees off the tribal rolls, I think like a decade ago or something like that. Like if you base things on race can only dilute over time because people mix. And so what you have is a kind of sandcastle of identity that worked in 1900 for the purposes it was intended, which was to assert claims to land and claims to rights. But over time, everyone's quantum changes. And when you've pegged belonging to a culture, a nation, a people that's existed for millennia to biological blood, you're going to disappear because we all mix. And that was the other kind of lesson from what I saw in Choctaw history, was constant crisscrossing of peoples and mixing of peoples, but always that thing Choctaw was there. And so the blood quantum is it's a dead end. But it seems to me, from what I've been able to follow in contemporary politics across Oklahoma and the nations there, it's live and kicking, and it has to be grappled with because it contains logics and a kind of biological reality that mean that forecast disappearance when that's not happening at all. And it will become out of pace with anything anyone will know as the reality of Choctaw Nation. So finding a way to divorce identity from blood quantum is probably an imperative for the next century.
Yeah, to kind of build on that, right? If you want less Indians, that means there's more land for the United States to kind of take, right? The history of the United States is one of constant Indian land possession, and it's something we're constantly kind of fighting for against. And so blood quantum makes it so there are less Native people, and so then there's less people to contest their land dispossession. And so for me, that is, Jamie's an Australian, and Patrick Wolf was the one who talks about land dispossession as a structure, and so blood quantum figures so much into that. So.
Yeah, and I just read a dissertation here in Australia recently. It was about an interesting concept about the fair-skinned Aboriginal person and how can they assert an identity when they don't have the biological markers of being Aboriginal in Australia. And it comes from this history of genocide and intentional cultural extermination. When a government has set itself to fight against you for 100 years, it obliterates a lot of the context and connections you have to country, to people, to kin, to identity. And a forced policy of assimilation changes what you look like. So how do you assert an actual real identity across those decades of destruction that have left you without a clan, that have left you without the physical markers that the stereotype expects? And so it's whenever race and blood quantum and kind of expectations of physical appearance get mixed into it, it takes everything away from what it seems to be all about, which is believing in certain things and practicing certain things and having inherited certain things. So it's a fraught issue. I mean, and probably one for a later day when we have more time, because it can't be neatly
Yes.
packed.
Oh, we are
Yeah.
also out of time, unfortunately.
Oh,
Um, but yeah, so thank you so much, Jamie, for joining us, for explaining your book to our community members. There's so much to kind of learn from it. And so, yeah, Koki, Ryan,
well,
do you want to say
thanks.
anything before I sign off?
Yeah, and thanks, Megan, and thanks, Ryan, for inviting me along to talk about it. I really appreciated this opportunity, and I'm grateful to you both.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, and I, I I really feel like this recording will help that next generation of Choctaw historians. So,
And I'm always on the other end of
Absolutely.
email if anyone ever wants to ask anything.
oh yeah, we'll be bothering you. Don't worry.
Okay, great.
Yes, awesome. So that is it for today. Yakuti, Dr. Carson, for your time. We appreciate you joining us so early in the morning in Australia.
Oh,
And so next month, we won't have a Chasa Tishuli next month. So our next one will be in July. So look out for that. And Chipi Fulatiki.